Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Kent Fellows. I am the Research Director of the Canadian Northern Corridor Research Program, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, where the School of Public Policy and the University of Calgary are located. Treaty 7 includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you all to our webinar today. We're joined by Ian Satchwell. Ian has 35 years of experience in private and public sector forming policy for resource development and infrastructure. He's led teams providing analysis and advice to governments, industry bodies, universities, non-government organizations in several global regions. He's an adjunct professor at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. He's served on the board of several organizations, including the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, Indonesia Business Council and Chamber of Commerce, and the Industry of Western Australia. Oh, sorry, that's one thing. That's a big, long name. Apologies for getting that wrong. Ian is also a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee to the Canadian Northern Corridor Program, and we are very pleased to have had him engaged in our research for the past several years, helping us guide and finding good questions to answer and good people to answer them, including in this particular occasion himself. So Ian is going to talk briefly about his most recent publication on our paper series, The Australia Experience with Resources, Infrastructure Corridors, and Supply Chains. And then we'll have some time for a Q&A from the audience, so get your questions ready. And with that, I'll turn it over. Take it away, Ian.
Thank you very much, Kent. I'll just share my screen and we'll get underway with the presentation. So, as Kent said, this is the title of the paper that was recently published by the School of Public Policy's Canadian Northern Corridor Project. And I've subtitled this for this webinar, Lessons for Canada's North. Before I move on, I too would like to acknowledge the First Nations people of the two regions that the paper in this webinar looks at. So the First Nations people of the Pilbara region of Western Australia, First Nations people of Central Queensland, and the Mackay-Whitsunday regions, which make up the Central Queensland Coalfields, and the First Nations people of Perth, from where I am speaking to you in Western Australia, the Whadjuk Noongar people. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Right now, there are planes flying over my house in Perth, and today some 13,000 or more than 13,000 resources workers will fly to and from the Pilbara region, mostly from Perth, but also from some regional centres in the southwest. And on the left there is a screenshot from Flight Radar 24, this time yesterday, showing the number of aircraft taking workers to and from that region. This week, 22 million tonnes of mineral and energy products will be shipped through the Pilbara and Central Queensland ports. Some imports, but mostly bulk exports. And this is a screenshot from Vessel Finder, which shows each of those yellow dots are ships waiting to come into the port of Gladstone to load coal, alumina, or LNG. And that's just one port in Central Queensland and one port in the two regions. So a quick overview of this webinar. First of all, Canada's and Australia's northern regions are similar in many ways, and we'll talk about that as the webinar goes on. Notably, except climate. Today, the maximum temperature in Pilbara towns will be somewhere between 35 degrees on the coast and 40 degrees inland. It can get up to 45 or more in very hot periods, and it's our summer at the moment, so we can expect that. In Central Queensland, 32 to 35 is the expected temperatures in the various towns there. Now, Canada and Australia can learn from each other's northern development experience, as can other resource-rich jurisdictions. And by many measures, Canada and Australia are the two leading resources jurisdictions. And for another time, we should talk more about how Canada and Australia exercise global leadership. Excuse me. Mineral and energy resources in the Pilbara and Central Queensland coalfields have been developed in large scale since the 1960s. And over that time, from then until now, two world-leading resources regions have developed. But had the development potential of the Pilbara and Central Queensland coalfields been understood in the 1960s and 70s, I believe different decisions would have been made about development policies and infrastructure by both developers, project resources companies, and by governments. That said, approaches have changed over time as learning has developed, and between the two regions, those approaches are converging and moving towards, in many cases, setting leading practices. Now, a quick snapshot of Northern Australia. Northern Australia comprises 53% of Australia's landmass, and this is Northern Australia as defined by the federal government for policy reasons, but it only has 5.2% of Australia's population. So relative to the southeast and southwest of the nation, it's underpopulated. Northern Australia has a massive natural resource base and massive resources production. As I've just explained, it's got climatic extremes. Not only does it get hot in summer, but it also can get very wet, and parts of Northern Australia are subject to Asian monsoonal effects. There are substantial infrastructure deficits still, despite 50, 60 years of resources development. And there are quite fragile supply chains, as has been demonstrated with floods in recent months. In many ways, the various economies that make up Northern Australia are developing rather than characterised as developed within a highly developed country, of course. And aligned with that, many people living in Northern Australia, mostly Indigenous people, are disadvantaged, in some cases quite severely so. Now, the scope of the paper examined transportation infrastructure corridors and supply chains for resources industries, but it also looked at development and policy around other infrastructure classes, for example, and especially social infrastructure. It looks at the histories of development and how these have influenced decision-making by governments and investors over time. As I've already said, that has changed. It looks at similarities and differences of approach and outcomes in each region over their histories. It examines some of the challenges experienced during development and operation of infrastructure and how governments and developers have responded. And then finally, the paper seeks to draw lessons from Northern Canada and other regions. Just on the left there, I've got screenshots of the two ports. Port Hedland in Western Australia, I think, is the world's largest port by tonnage. You can see all the iron ore ships lined up there within a very constrained harbour. Some snapshots of the two regions. So the Pilbara region, you can see on the map on the right, it's over well north of where I'm sitting in Perth, 12 to 1,500 kilometres north, and the Central Queensland coalfields are a similar latitude over on the east coast of Australia in Queensland. The population of the Pilbara is only 58,000. Indeed, the workforce in the Pilbara is over 60,000, so larger than the population. There are just 10 towns and cities in the Pilbara, but the output tonnage is just phenomenal, 897 million tonnes last year. And the gross regional product rivals that of several Australian states and indeed quite a few countries around the world, 75 billion Australian dollars. The major products out of the Pilbara are iron ore, which dominates the tonnages, also offshore gas, which is turned into LNG, as well as domestic gas and oil, salt, utilising the very hot, dry climate, particularly during winter, ammonia and urea manufactured from natural gas, copper and more recently lithium to feed battery industries, and there are two major lithium projects in development and operating in the Pilbara. And in the future, there should be some very large-scale renewables oriented to producing products such as green hydrogen, green ammonia for export. There are 42 major mines, 4 LNG plants, 6 ports hosting 8 bulk terminals, and notably there are 4 separate privately operated rail systems, and I'll come back to that later. Central Queensland, by contrast, has quite a large population for a regional area of Australia of 400,000, living in 28 cities and towns, and those cities might range from, well, they do range from, say, 50,000 people to service populations of over 100,000. Some of the towns are much smaller, and I'll touch on that a bit later. The output, smaller than the Pilbara, but still large, 260 million tonnes, driven by coal, both metallurgical and thermal, and a gross regional product, very large, again at 50 billion. Products, I've already mentioned metallurgical coal, which is the larger of the 2 classes of coal exported. Thermal coal, which is expected to decline in quantity as the world shifts towards renewable energy. Coal seam gas turned into LNG, alumina and aluminum, ammonia and urea, like the Pilbara, and large-scale thermal electricity production from coal. Similar to the Pilbara, 49 mines, there are 3 LNG plants, 3 major ports hosting 5 bulk terminals, and importantly, 1 railway system operated by 1 below rail operator and several above rail operators, and I will come back to that. Some quick histories of resources development. Major development in both regions began in the 1960s. First iron ore development, there were 1, 2, 3 initial iron ore projects, later 4 of about 1 million tonnes output each. 897 million tonnes is the output right now, or a little bit less because there's LNG as well. In the 1970s in the Pilbara, development of copper production, gold production, salt, and in the 1970s in Central Queensland Coalfields, alumina and aluminium production started, in particular driven for aluminum by relatively low-cost energy from large-scale coal-fired power. The Pilbara's LNG development began in the 1980s and expanded greatly in the 2000s, and in 2014 in Central Queensland, LNG exports commenced from onshore coal seam gas sources. And ammonia urea in both regions in 2010s through to 2020, and most recently in the Pilbara, large-scale lithium production. So the 2 regions have a parallel history, albeit with different products. And they share a lot of similarities as well as some differences. And I'll just outline those now. First of all, in similarities, minerals and energy have been the dominant drivers of development and infrastructure provision in both regions. When development began, and even today, governments have limited financial resources to invest in things like multi-user infrastructure, and that has engendered different approaches, which I'll talk about. There have been very strong roles which have been strengthened in more recent years in coordination and facilitation of projects and coordination of infrastructure corridors as well. Increasingly important in both regions is the role of skilled workforces, both to work in the resources sector and also to provide services to communities. And social infrastructure has become increasingly important to improve the livability in these regions to enable workforces and their families to be attracted to live there. And there have been converging development and infrastructure policies starting from somewhat different start points. The major differences in development of each region is that there was a dominantly government-led role in infrastructure provision in the Central Queensland Coalfields, and in Pilbara, it was industry-led, and industry provided almost 100% of the necessary infrastructure, except for schools and hospitals and roads and those sorts of things that government provides, but all of the other infrastructure was provided by industry, and much of it still is provided by industry today. The industry funding models for infrastructure varied between the two regions. Faced with severe resource constraints in the 1960s, the government of Western Australia required each developer of iron ore and later of LNG to provide their own infrastructure and pay for it. In Central Queensland, the rail system and ports were built by government, but they were funded by security deposits paid by companies. And those security deposits were then repaid back to those companies over time from revenue from hauling coal on the rail system. In the Pilbara, because industry built its own railways and ports, the Pilbara developed very integrated pit-to-ship product chains. And these are some of the most efficient product chains in the world because they're fully controlled by the miner and delivered, and the product then is delivered very efficiently, hundreds of kilometres to ports and loaded onto ships. In Central Queensland, the supply chains have been non-integrated. While the rail system is one integrated rail system, the intermodal points have historically led to inefficiencies, a lack of coordination between mining, railing, unloading at bulk terminals and loading onto ships. That has caused some inefficiencies in supply chains, and they have not been historically a best practice, but increasingly tweaks have been made to deliver better practice. There's a much larger population in Central Queensland Coalfields, which helps overcome some of the workforce issues. And in the Pilbara, there is an increasing role of fly-in, fly-out. And I highlighted that earlier in the presentation. And that's a pragmatic response by the state government because the Pilbara has quite a harsh environment, a very harsh environment. It is difficult to get people to live there, particularly when their children get to secondary school age. So the government in Western Australia has taken a pragmatic approach to fly-in, fly-out, whereas in Central Queensland, the Queensland government has actually recently mandated regional resident workers in the resources sector, as well as requiring resources companies to source as many of their goods and services locally as they can. So, lessons for corridor development. First, and I've got four themes here. The first issue is that infrastructure decision-making in a newly developing region or even in a well-developed region faces uncertainties. And so uncertainties can be timing and scale of major resources projects, changes in markets, future requirements of supply chains, and also patterns of population growth. So how to deal with those uncertainties? They can be upside uncertainties. They can also be downside uncertainties, and with big risks of stranded assets if governments and developers get it wrong. So approaches suggested to deal with uncertainties are to take an options-based approach and assess scenarios for markets and for development, undertake corridor and precinct planning that can cater for a range of potential futures. Infrastructure doesn't necessarily need to be built, but detailed planning needs to be undertaken so that infrastructure can be built in the future. And just as an example, in the top map on the right-hand side, this is a map of Pilbara ports active, and the mauve ones, there are two there, are non-operational. These ports have been designated, the planning has been done, but they have not been built. But they are ready to be built when and if required. The second approach I already mentioned, options, taking options-based approaches to scenarios and plannings to maximise flexibility in response to changing circumstances, including the scale of development, upside and downside, and the output. And finally, governments have a unique role to play in land planning and development coordination. Governments generally control land and can control access to land, and are often well placed to negotiate land access agreements on behalf of future developers. And also governments have a strong role to play in development coordination. On the right is a map of the Stanwell-Gladstone Infrastructure Corridor State Development Area that is designed to take multiple types of infrastructure between the industrial and power generation area of Stanwell to the west of Rockhampton and the major industrial and port town of Gladstone. There is nothing, if anything, in the corridor at the moment, but it has been planned in great detail, and various land clearances have been conducted. The second lesson for corridor development is that, and this has some tension inherent in it, supply chain efficiency is paramount to investors in resources projects. They want to get from a mine to a port or a processing plant, transporting large tonnages as efficiently as they can. And certainly efficiently at world-leading practice so that they can compete on international markets. At the same time, host jurisdictions wish to ensure economic efficiency by avoiding unnecessary infrastructure duplication. And a prime example of that, of course, is the 4 railway systems in the Pilbara, and also to minimise barriers to new entrants. And again, those rail systems operated by each major producer provide a real barrier to new entrants. It's only in the last decade or so that agreements between the government and permits to develop have required new iron ore miners to negotiate access to their rail systems or hook and pull arrangements for smaller new entrants. So approaches to plan for infrastructure while simultaneously prioritising supply chain efficiency for producers, overall jurisdictional economic efficiency and access for new entrants. And as is now being demonstrated, all 3 are simultaneously possible. Producers, existing large producers, would prefer not probably to share their supply chains, but if it's a ticket to licensing of a new project, then they have been demonstrated to agree. In Central Queensland, it's, if you like, going the other way or converging with the Pilbara in that while producers have been forced to use common railways, increasingly some producers are running their own trains on the railways, so they're at least controlling better the actual transportation of coal. Planning and providing infrastructure and corridors and development precincts that can be used by multiple entities is a key role of government and for multiple compatible uses over time. And that helps meet the efficiency goals and allows new entrants. And on the left, you can see the Callide Infrastructure Corridor, and you've got 3 green stripes through farmland there, And each of those stripes carries a gas pipeline that's constructed and operated by a different operator, but it's going through the common user or multi-user corridor designated by government. And the paper explains the advantages of that approach. And then finally, integrating regional energy, particularly electricity and water systems to enhance efficiency of delivery. In Central Queensland, the electricity system has been fully integrated since development began, but in the Pilbara, the electricity system is only now being integrated, pulling together the separate electricity systems operated by major companies. The third of the four lessons goes to policy and coordination by governments, and this has been demonstrated to be very, very important. So the role of governments in designated resources corridors, as I've been talking about, is crucial to development, and so too is coordination and facilitation of development of infrastructure. So approaches are to use government's powers over land and planning to identify potential ports within an options framework, those development precincts and potential infrastructure corridors, and then undertake reservation, conclude strategic land access agreements, environmental assessments, so to facilitate development by multiple users. And then finally, implementing efficient project assessment, approval and facilitation processes that work across agencies within a level of government, typically a state government, and between levels of government, typically between state level government and national government, which does have a range of development and environmental responsibilities. And where possible, include strategic access agreements and environmental approvals of corridors and precincts, lowering the barrier to individual developers of, for example, pipelines. Finally, the people factor. I already flagged this. There has been a historic focus on hard infrastructure to service supply chains for resource sector outputs in particular, but also inputs. But as has been demonstrated, the urgent need is also for social infrastructure and associated policy to enhance the livability of regional towns and cities. At the same time, a pragmatic approach is required to fly in, fly out. So I'll go through the approaches. So where substantial regional cities and towns exist, improving livability to attract and retain workers and their families, and at the same time seeking to increase the size of those communities to further improve livability and also enhance the level of capability to be a service hub for the resources sector and other economic sectors in regions. Central Queensland is finding that easier to do because it has larger regional cities and towns, although given it has 28 total communities, some of those are subscale and they struggle to attract and retain people and struggle to be a services hub. Where there are few or subscale regional settlements and or resources operations are remote from existing communities, typically in the Pilbara, a pragmatic approach, as I said, is required to support FIFO, fly-in, fly-out working arrangements from cities elsewhere. In Central Queensland, there's been a mandating of no FIFO where possible, but instead there's quite a bit of DIDA, drive in, drive out, from larger cities proximate to the coast. So people drive in, workers drive in for a week and then drive home again the next weekend. Stronger measures are required to deliver lasting regional economic and social benefits, and in particular in Northern Australia, to help link Indigenous people to the economic and hopefully social benefits of resources development. So final slide, summary policy recommendations. First of all, I highlighted the need to take an options-based approach to allow for uncertainties and avoid locking in supply chain inadequacies or economic inefficiencies. Seek to maximise supply chain integration while avoiding exclusion of new producers and also avoiding of infrastructure duplication. Role of governments is very strong, both for corridors and for facilitation of development. Cross-government coordination between governments and within governments is really necessary. And then finally, infrastructure to support communities is essential while taking a pragmatic approach to fly in, fly out. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. We now move on to some Q&A, and I'll be pleased to take your questions and answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian. That was a great distillation of the paper. I think you covered the main basis really well, not surprisingly. I have a couple of questions that I'll lead off with, but I'll also remind the audience, we have a Q&A open via the Zoom. So that'll be down at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you can submit questions and you can upvote others' questions. So please go ahead and do that. We're not taking questions via speaking or through the chat. We're going to take those through the Q&A to keep things a little bit more organized. So please, if you've got a question, make sure you're submitting it through the Q&A portal. And so I'll lead off with mine, taking the sort of the intro moderator's privilege. You talked a little bit about market uncertainties and market risk as considerations for decision making in this space. We know infrastructure entails large fixed costs, often, especially if it's a mode specific thing, there'll be a sunk cost. And so I think here of Canada's experience, southern British Columbia, early on in the coal development cycle, there were a number of investments there that were made based on long-term contracting with export partners to make sure that you had that 10, 20, 30 years to pay back if you were going to build something like a coal terminal or a new rail line or something like that. So given that, and given that we're currently in this, in the middle, the beginning, near the end of an energy transition, a market shift to renewable energy, a consequent reduction of demand for coal and gas, how do you see that affecting the two regions, the decision making in the regions, the industrial experience there?
Okay. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, from Central Queensland, there are two key types of coal. Thermal coal for energy generation domestically and for export. Exports of thermal coal are already starting to shift and are expected to decline. The other type of coal is metallurgical coal, coal for steel making. And right now, with current steelmaking technology, it's a non-substitutable item. So metallurgical coal for the foreseeable future has still a strong market outlook. It will decline because there are green steel technologies being developed. But for now, the vast bulk of steel is made using metallurgical coal. In terms of thermal coal, there is market uncertainty. Thermal coal demand is expected to decline in Australia, although export markets will continue to demand it, given the construction still of coal-fired power stations in Asia to our north. And Australian thermal coal is preferable to high sulphur coals from some other regions. So in response, governments and mining companies, if you like, are taking out options. So for development of new large-scale thermal coal mines, planning has been done. If demand is still to enable development, particularly of what's known as the Galilee Basin, and that's in a map in the paper to the northwest of the current coal development basins, and Bowen Basin in particular. So corridors have been defined, ports have been planned, nothing yet has been built. And it may not be built. But if demand is there and the developer wishes to go ahead and Australian government policy aligns, then it can be built. With respect to liquefied natural gas, and Australia is one of the world's largest LNG producers, along with Qatar and the United States. And Canada's a substantial producer, I understand, as well. LNG is a vital transition fuel, so it's necessary for transition to renewables, because right now storage technology is not up to it's not adequate to underpin ongoing stable power supplies as economies in Australia, Asia, or indeed Canada transition. So gas is a very important enabler of development of renewable energy. I'm sounding a little bit ideological, but I'm trying to be pragmatic, because investment in LNG in Western Australia in particular, from offshore gas, is still proceeding. And the reason it's proceeding is there is demand there. And it's not just the Ukraine-Russia situation has accelerated the growth of demand, but there's also demand in Asia to underpin energy transition away from coal through to renewables, with natural gas as the vital fuel for stabilising power systems. On the upside, of course, new products such as lithium, salt for chloralkali chemicals plants is vital. And copper, of course, is another strategic or critical mineral to underpin the energy transition. So there's some hedging, if you like, within the product mix of both regions. I hope that's answered your question, Kent.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think your your comment there on taking legacy fuels seriously without coming across as ideological, but also keeping open the option value for critical minerals is very much a lesson that Canada should take to heart. We're having our own conversation on whether we miss the window on LNG and whether there's scope to play in that, but at the same time we're having very similar conversations about critical minerals. So yeah, no, that's a fantastic answer. I'm looking at the chat here, and we've had a couple of questions come in. So while I have lots of my own questions that I like to get to, I am going to defer, because that's, we have the audience here, and I want to make sure that their questions get in. So the first one here, I'll read it verbatim. Thank you very much, Ian, for the interesting presentation. This study is in some ways related to my PhD study, and I can't wait to read the report. A question I have is, you mentioned earlier that the two regions took slightly different approaches to develop an infrastructure corridor. Did you find in the planning stage whether it was a conscious strategization that was made to ensure the infrastructure built is suitable for utilization by the economic sectors, especially post-mining? So I'll toss that one to you. And
Okay. Well, the questioner I talked about slightly different approaches in the early days of development of transportation infrastructure, so rail corridors and ports and terminals. The two jurisdictions took quite different approaches. As I mentioned, Western Australia required the iron ore companies to fund and build 100% of the infrastructure, whereas in Queensland, the coal companies were required to provide a security deposit, which then funded rail and port development. But those classes of infrastructure are no matter the differences in the approach to their development, are not really related to other economic uses. They are bulk transportation systems. Governments have provided roads. They have serviced towns, although in the Pilbara, again, the iron ore companies and later the first LNG mover was required to build substantially the towns required to service their operations, although government provided essential services like schools and health facilities, etc. But in the Pilbara, and I didn't mention this, there has been a normalisation of towns over time. So those towns have been handed back to government by the iron ore producers, in some cases with fairly life-expired infrastructure, but that's another issue. It certainly is an issue, particularly for local government. And though the normalisation of those towns, and in Central Queensland, towns have always been normalised, as is the term, with multi-user communities, those towns are much better able to service other elements of the economy. That said, in Central Queensland, the economy is more rounded, larger population, deeper agricultural economy, more minerals processing. In the Pilbara, there is an issue of lack of connection still between the resources economy and the local economy, the local tire retailer or the restaurants and that sort of local resources economy. And there is a third economy, a separate economy, I suggest in both regions, and that is the Indigenous economy. And sadly, it's quite weakly connected. It's connected to the local service economy, sure, but it's very weakly connected to the resources economy. And that, again, can be, I think, a worthy topic of study for another day. I know a number of companies have looked at that in terms of their overall ESG strategies, how to create better connections. So I've gone a little bit off topic from the questioner, but it has opened up another interesting point, which I suspect might be related to the questioner's PhD.
I would think you're probably apt on that. That's one of the things about corridor research, that the more time you spend, the more you get this scope creep as one thing affects another thing affects another thing. And actually is a perfect segue into the next audience question that I'll pitch to you. We have a question here on sort of relating northern security issues to the corridor concept. And so the questioner has asked, said that they're looking at parallels between the Australia JORN radar project or JORN radar project. I'm not familiar, but you're nodding your head. And similar proposed projects in Canada's north. Have you considered synergies between defence and resource projects in Northern Australia? Any thoughts that you've got on that?
Okay. So a couple of things. Yes, Central Australia, so immediately to the east of the Pilbara, hosts indeed several major defence facilities, including a joint one with the United States. But the over-the-horizon radar system is now quite old technology, but it's still highly relevant. It uses bounce off the ionosphere to detect incoming aircraft, or I think even shipping, way to Australia's north. And so that over-the-horizon radar is a very important early warning system for Australia, for Australia's defence. Similar in some ways to the very old early warning systems that I think US and Canada cooperated on during the Cold War. I think the other area, so resources sector and facilities such as the Joint Defence Facility with the US, the JORN system, can be, the synergy is around livability of the towns and cities in which defence personnel and resources industry personnel live, and governments and defence establishments and resources companies all have an interest in making sure the livability is very high. The other area is in the area of what we call in Australia critical infrastructure, and there's been a lot of focus on critical infrastructure protection. And indeed, there are naval patrols around the offshore oil and gas facilities, because that is critical not only for Australia's or Western Australia's gas supply for its industry, but also for maintaining the reputation of Australia as a very, very reliable supplier of LNG. And LNG for energy systems in Asia is absolutely mission critical for those countries. So protection of critical infrastructure in terms of things like offshore facilities, softer security like ensuring supply chain resilience, when there have been floods, and we've had major floods in Australia over the last 2 years, and that has really exposed the fragility of supply chains, and it affects not just the towns in in remote regions, but also the resources industries, because they can't get the inputs such as fuel into to run their operations if the roads or the railways have been compromised by flooding. So Defence has a similar interest in Northern Australia in ensuring strong supply chains. There's one more point I'd like to make on this, in that the capability of local industry to service the resources sector and to service the defence sector has much in common. Very similar technologies and skills required. So the defence of Northern Australia and the resources sector in Northern Australia have similar interests in building local industry capability and sourcing as much input as they can from local businesses and local skilled workers to build that regional resilience. And I think that's another lesson potentially for Northern Canada.
And I'll do a really quick pitch here. I don't want to steal thunder from you, Ian, because we are here to listen to you and to get questions answered by you. But I'll do another quick pitch that some of the other research coming out of the Northern Corridor program, in particular done by my colleague, Dr. Katarina Koch, who's on the call today, but is being a silent partner. It looks at parallels between Australia and Northern Canada dealing with Northern and Arctic security. And then there's some of her work as well that just looks at the Canadian side of things. So for, I think it was Lee who asked that question, I definitely direct you toward Dr. Koch's research on that, because I think it might be able to expand upon some of the stuff that we don't have time to talk about today. So moving on to another audience question here, sort of related to that, but to keep you on your feet, a question about stakeholder interests and stakeholder engagement, stakeholder relations. So I'll read the question verbatim instead of hacking it apart. How have corridor developers in Australia managed the various stakeholder interests when each stakeholder group could have dramatically differing interests? How has the Australian government supported resource development projects compared to here in Canada, where there's very active opposition to resource projects? And I'll add one more editorial comment on that. You know, when we talk to First Nations communities and when we listen to them, it's not a homogenous group, right? We've got several First Nations organizations in Canada that are very pro resource development, and others who are very against it for legitimate reasons in terms of local environmental destruction, concerns about damage to traditional ways of living and trap lines. So a really nice, simple softball question for you. Ian, take a stab at it. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, well, I would, I think, characterize the interest groups into 4 different categories. So first of all, you've already mentioned First Nations people. So the traditional landowners through Northern Australia have absolutely key interest, and they also have very strong legislative leverage, as highlighted in a recent paper on the Australian Indigenous land rights system. The second group would be farmers, either croppers or in most cases graziers, both in Central Queensland and the Pilbara. And they have obviously particular interests because they are large land holders, either freehold or leasehold. The third interest group is local communities. And you would think that a local resources-oriented community, that is, where the resources sector is playing a major role in an economy, they would be really supportive of the resources sector in the local operations. That's not always so for a range of reasons. The fourth, and I'll be really pejorative here just for entertainment, I'll call them the cafe latte or Chardonnay set of the major cities of the southeast of Australia, who are very influential politically. And I'm being unfair. The majority of the Australian population is very concerned about the environment, particularly about climate change. They're very concerned about the rights of Indigenous people, and as they should be. And they are very politically influential. Unfortunately, because of where they live, which is many thousands of kilometres from resource regions, their knowledge of what's going on really is very limited. Okay, let's deal with first group, which are the traditional owners. In Australia, they have very strong legislative rights. That hasn't delivered, or legislated rights, I should say, that requires under native title legislation or that they have a right to negotiate and agreements must be reached. Although with infrastructure corridors, while negotiations go on, infrastructure corridors are carved out from the strict requirement to reach agreements, but in practice, agreements are reached. The problem is, one, the legislation, as the other School of Public Policy paper points out, is very complicated, and negotiations are taking a long time, in some cases over a decade. And the recognition of traditional ownership is also taking a long time to get through the system. The other issue, as I've pointed out, is that the Indigenous people, by and large, are not sharing equitably in the benefits of resources development in these regions. It's not for want of trying. It's complicated. It goes to the level of disadvantage of these people, which goes to education levels, goes to social obligations in communities. It goes to remoteness of communities. It's difficult, but the resources companies and governments are certainly working harder than they ever have to engage Indigenous people in workforces and in business, and also through compensation agreements, initiatives to improve child rearing, education, to hopefully over a generation better equip some of the communities to engage more strongly in the resources sector. It's difficult, but it's an absolute necessity. The second area is farmers, and in general, resources development in Australia has priority over use of farming land. But in practice, farmers, whether they be leaseholders or freeholders, reach agreement with resources companies, and forms of compensation are negotiated. The third group, local resource communities, really goes to, again, the resources communities perceiving that they are copying some of the downsides of local resources development. Traffic, for example, not getting as much of the upsides as they believe they should. In Queensland, as well as in Western Australia, there are increasingly strong policies and efforts by the resources companies, or policies by government and efforts by the resources companies to engage local communities economically, because it's more equitable, but it also helps create a stronger level of support by those communities. And finally, the people in the major cities of Australia, particularly in the southeast corner. Perth, where I am, is very understanding of the resources sector. We see it and hear it every day. The plane's going over my house now. And so the benefits are obvious. Indeed, they're more obvious than they are in the Pilbara, because it's such a hollow economy despite the large regional product. But in the southeast of Australia, people want to see action on Indigenous development, lifting the social and socio-economic outcomes of Indigenous people and helping them to lift out of their general level of disadvantage. And they want to see very strong levels of environmental protection. On climate change, that's difficult, because we believe in Australia we're seeing the impacts of climate change. A famous poem by a poet called Dorothy M. Keller calls Australia the land of droughts and flooding rains. And we should add bushfires as well. So the resources sector and development of resources is facing a challenge of perception and reality, but that's driven by the voting blocks of the large cities in the southeast. And it's a good thing. And resources companies and government policies are changing.
Fantastic. So we're coming up on the end of the hour here. We got about 5 minutes left, but I'd love to be able to do a clean sweep of the audience questions, and there's one left. So I'll turn that over to you. I have enough that we can keep going for another hour, but I want to make sure that everyone on your half of the planet can start their day on time, and everyone on my half of the planet can end their day on time. So I'll give you just 2 or 3 minutes if you can answer this one. Are the various states and federal government aligned about infrastructure build out for developing natural resources? Are there high priority environmental government constrictions? So I think maybe here the parallel to Canada would be something like we have a tanker ban off of part of the West Coast for crude oil tankers, and there are protected areas for species at risk. And so just wondering about what that looks like in your part of the world.
Okay, I'll take this question in 2 parts. First of all, alignment on general infrastructure policy. There hasn't been really good alignment until recently. And the advent of Infrastructure Australia, which was established some years ago, a decade ago, has helped align each state and territory in Australia with the national government and put in place common infrastructure justification and assessment and prioritisation processes. And if anyone's really interested in that, they can go to the Infrastructure Australia website. They can see the Australian Infrastructure Plan, which sets out policies to be addressed to improve Australia's infrastructure planning. And I worked on the Northern Australia section of that. There's an annual infrastructure priority list published, and that is helping to align governments around infrastructure policy. In terms of the environmental impact of supply chains, in particular, the Great Barrier Reef, called the world's largest living organism off the Central Queensland coast and right up through to Cape York. It really is a very special area, and I recommend coming over and go diving or snorkeling on it. It's just amazing, just a complete new underwater world. The ships exporting coal and LNG have to thread their way through the Barrier Reef, and the penalty for getting it wrong, running aground, as very occasionally can happen, can be quite dire, particularly if there's a major oil spill. So there's a lot of risk management put into place by both the Queensland government and the federal Australian government, which controls offshore shipping, to ensure that risks are minimised. The other area is in runoff, farmland runoff, high fertiliser loads, and runoff down river sediments from near coal mining, for example. And both the Queensland government and federal government are working very hard to control runoff to minimise damage to the reef. They're just 2 examples of where the governments are working together, and I think they're going to be working even more closely together in the future.
Perfect. And we have about 1.5 minutes to go. So that was an excellent length for that answer. I'm gonna apologize. There were a couple of questions from School of Public Policy faculty and staff that didn't make it through for time. So I'll apologize to my colleagues there, but we can probably see if we can set up another quick chat with Ian or do something through email via that. I'd also like to thank Anita Denton, who's here running stuff in the background for us. She's the School of Public Policy account there in the corner. And I think there's one more thing that she wants to put up at the end of the session. So stick around. We have a quick notification for there it goes, for some other stuff we're doing. But before I read out that, I want to say thanks so much, Ian, for doing this for us, both the webinar and the paper. Your insights have been invaluable to our program over the years, and today I think is a perfect example of that. Just hearing you talk about stuff from experience and giving your analytical take on all this, I really appreciate it. I know our audience appreciates it, and everyone involved with the Northern Corridor program really appreciates it. So my thanks to you.
Thank you, Kent. I've very much enjoyed my interactions with the school and look forward to it in the future.
Excellent. So I'll close by saying we will have at least one more of these webinars that we're trying to plan for late February or early March. So everyone in the audience, stay tuned for that. We'll be sending out a notification of that. We have a number of papers to go up in the next 2 months. Anyone who enjoyed today's talk who hasn't read Ian Satchwell's paper yet, that is now up on our website, so you can go and find that at canadiancorridor.ca. And I'll close with reference to the slide that's up in front of you right now. We are currently advertising for our Executive Certificate in Fundamentals of ESG Management, Surviving and Thriving in the New ESG Reality. That's put on by my colleagues in the Extractive Resource Governance program here at the School of Public Policy. So if you're interested in that, or if you know anyone who might be interested in that, please visit ergp.ca to learn more. And I think with that, I will say we'll close the session, and I'll do one more thanks to Ian, thanks to Anita, and thanks for the entire audience for coming and asking really great questions. I always enjoy these, and so hope to see you at the next one.